Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
I'm trying to figure out why everybody came here this evening. I'm sure it was for the iPad. Or your professors made it a matter of faith and morals and passing the course to be here. I'm sure that's it. In any case, Jesus will bring out anybody, I suppose, and everybody, and that's the one I guess we should attribute this splendiferous attendance to, believe me. It's a fun topic because Jesus, the character of Jesus, has been manipulated, changed, caricatured, denied, more than that of any other figure in history. You love him or you hate him, evidently. And so there are so many caricatures out there that I'd like to begin by the unreal Jesus, people playing what I like to call the Jesus game. Here's how you play it. You read the New Testament quickly and not very carefully. Then you put it away for a year or two, and then you let the facts mellow in your brain, and then you be very creative about it, and you draw another picture of Jesus, mostly not drawn from the Bible, and if the resulting image of Jesus is anything like you see in the New Testament, you lose the Jesus game. But if you get something really off the wall, something over the top, something that could not possibly have been Jesus, then you win. It's sensational. Everybody will talk about it. They'll be the path to the bookstore and get your latest put down on Jesus. And really, it's kind of unfair the way this historical figure has been treated most recently in the last a century and a half, I guess. There's been the most of the critical attacks on Jesus. The debate, by the way, is changing. The debate used to be between those who thought Jesus was indeed what he claimed to be the Son of God and those who thought he was only a man. Now the debate has shifted to, well, we know he couldn't be Son of God, but was he even a man? And you get the other school coming along and says, no, he wasn't even a historical figure. So it kind of shows the directions in which this thing is lurching in terms of the historical Jesus. And so I think it's high time that maybe we ought to step back a little bit from the battle over the figure of Jesus and check out and see what some of these other caricatures may be. Now, it was really, the first part of the 20th century, too much serious stuff was going along. World War I, the Great Depression, dust storm, World War II, pretty serious stuff. And so they weren't engaging in the luxury of putting down the figure of Jesus. But after World War II, when things settled down, then we find one book after another coming out with another portrait of Jesus. First of all, we have Jesus, the Passover plotter. Now, you guys, the younger people, won't remember that, but your parents will tell you about it. Hugh Schoenfield, a British author, came across with this book, The Passover Plot, in which he has Jesus now plotting to finish off all the prophecies that Matthew and the other Gospels made about him, and that he then designed his own fulfillment of those passages, and he was supposed to evidently be given some kind of a narcotic on the cross, and it didn't do the job, and so he survived. That's how the resurrection happened. Okay, that's one view, and the guy had the audacity to publish this as fact and not fiction. But anyway, we go on to Jesus, the radical revolutionary. Now, you recall the Vietnam era, you older people, and you recall how everybody was getting the campus rioting, except at Iowa State, of course. But you think of Berkeley, California, and so forth, and the students getting together, deciding, shall we burn down the dean's house tonight or tomorrow night, and so forth. They're very radicalized era. Well, we have then the new authors coming along and drawing a caricature of Christ as the radical revolutionary. What do they base that on? By cutting little snips of Scripture apart. And Jesus had 12 disciples. One of them was named Simon the Zealot. Okay, there you have it. Zealotry was one of the radical political parties at the time, so Jesus was a radical revolutionary from the start, and he therefore would approve of burning American flags, evidently, and so forth. That didn't work too well. S.G.F. Brandon was a British author who had that idea, and before his death he said, "I think maybe I overdid it." No kidding. No kidding. Then let's see. Oh, yeah, John Allegro comes along. He was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars and a decent scholar before he wandered into La La Land. Wrote a book giving us the image of Jesus, the mushroom cultist. Yeah, hear me out. You won't believe this. He wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And in this 700-page book, published by Doubleday, and an otherwise responsible publisher until it came to the Da Vinci Code, of course, we have him seriously arguing that the Gospels were written by a group of mushroom-eating freaks who got high on the hallucinogenic properties of the red-topped, white-stalked mushroom, the kind you see in fairy tale books. And then they wrote the Gospels as kind of a code for their particular group. And they try to prove it by wonderful methods. For example, the raising of Lazarus now proves this image of Jesus. How is this possible? Well, raising of Lazarus, one of Jesus' big miracles. Lazarus sounds like lapis lazuli. I don't think it does, but let's say it does. That's the rich Mesopotamian blue. But if you add red to blue, you get purple, royal purple. And that's the red top of the mushroom. I kid you not. This passes for reliable prose. Unbelievable. And the mummy-like wrappings that Lazarus had on, that's indicated by the white flecks on top of the red top mushroom. Now, this is madness, of course. And yet, Doubleday published it because half the book is scholarly notes in 20 different languages. None of them mean anything. They're word salad, but did they ever hoodwink the editors at Doubleday? And yet, people were buying this book and made it something of a bestseller at the time. And then there's Jesus, the Master Magician. Oh, that's a popular. Yeah, Jesus did miracles like David Copperfield does miracles. And so, again, the secret gospel written by a professor of ancient history at in City College of New York. And this, of course, Morton Smith, his name was. And this, of course, now has proven to be the secret gospel of Mark. Some of you specialists will understand what I'm talking about. Has proven to be a forgery by Morton Smith himself. Unfortunately. Then we have Jesus, the senescent Savior. Jesus didn't die at age 33 or so. No, he lived on. Somebody took his place. This is, of course, what Muslims also believe. He lived on, didn't die at Calvary, and lived on to a jolly old age in a mansion overlooking the Dead Sea or something like that. Sorry, folks, no evidence for that either. Then there's Jesus the happy husband. Oh, yeah, that one's, of course, repopularized by Dan Brown. Jesus, of course, was a Jewish rabbi and teacher. They had to get married in those days, so Jesus also had to get married, even though his wife isn't named in the Bible. Well, I'm sorry, didn't they have Jewish bachelors in those days? Some guys probably too ugly to find a wife. I'm sure they did. And yet, there's no evidence of that whatever, despite what Dan Brown and others may say. I don't know why it's Mary Magdalene all the time. Why is she always Mrs. Jesus? You know, even in Jesus Christ Superstar. Well, I don't know. I love him. I don't know why I did that. That's the last solo you'll get this evening, folks. It's the only one. But they have tried to get him married off, and it doesn't work simply because there is no evidence like whatever. And every tool that Dan Brown uses in the Da Vinci Code to try to get Jesus married off, and there are many scholars like him, they're all like a bunch of worried mamas with a 55-year-old son who hadn't found his bride yet. Got to get him married off, you know. It doesn't work. And in this case, any argument that Dan Brown uses in the Da Vinci Code, it's like trying to get a rusty nut off of a bolt with a papier-mâché wrench. You use it the first time, it falls apart. And numbers alone will do it. What is the Da Vinci Code named for? Leonardo's great portrait of Jesus and the 12 disciples, right? How many heads should there be in the painting? 12 plus 1, otherwise known as 13. Okay, now Mary Magdalene comes along, and Jesus wants to sit next to his wife, of course, so he tells John to go to the end of the table, right? How many heads should there be in the famous painting? 14. Now, the next time you see Leonardo's great painting, count the number of heads. 13. Well, maybe John was drunk on the wine and fell under the table. Well, that's been suggested too. Well, sorry, Leonardo's tablecloth does not go down to the floor. There are only 26 legs there, folks. Count them. Not going to work. And so it goes one after another. The caricatures show up. John Dominic Crossan, you've seen him probably in a lot of TV shows on Jesus, the wonderful Irish the author who has all of these put-downs on Christianity. For instance, he loves to rattle Christian cages. Jesus' body wasn't buried in Joseph's tomb. Dogs ate his bones. You know, this kind of thing, always his little bombshell. Well, he wrote Jesus, the life of a Mediterranean peasant. And he has pictured Jesus as a wandering sage, telling jokes against the government, kind of a corrosive character with a good sense of humor. I don't know what image we can give Jesus on that one. Seinfeld the Savior, maybe? I don't know what it would be. But you have these again and again and again, and the latest is the Gnostic Gospels. Oh, I tell you, now we have all kinds of portraits of Jesus showing up from this apocryphal literature that shows up from the 2nd century on, 3rd and 4th century. Everybody making a big fuss about the Gnostic Gospels. Never mind that nearly all of them are word salad, and where they do have serious content, you have nothing there which is anything but derivative material from the 4 Gospels that we're familiar with. Little gildings of the lily, little additions to the Bible. We had biblical novelists 2,000 years ago, or at least 1,900 years ago. And so again, they're giving us different images which are supposed to be sensational, and indeed the public very often runs with them. Let me tell you, the selection of the canonical Gospels were not some kind of a March Madness situation where you came down to the Sweet 16 and then the Elite 8 and the Big 4 finally made it. Not the way it happened. And so all these other views you get of the portraits of Jesus, they're really all caricatures. And, well, let's take one of them, the Gospel of Philip. Now, Dan Brown uses that to prove that Jesus got married. Now, let me show you the papier-mâché wrench that he uses. Gospel of Philip claims that Jesus was married. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Gospel of Philip doesn't even say that. But I don't care if it did say that. I don't care if the Gospel of Philip said Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and John was his best man. I don't care who's a ring bearer or whatever else. But it's a late 3rd century derivative gospel. Nobody would give it the time of day. But, again, those who want to see Jesus get married off go with Dan Brown's argument. Okay, here's the argument. The disciples come to Jesus and they say, Lord, why do you prefer Mary Magdalene over us? Think of it, folks. If Jesus were married to the woman, would that question make any sense whatever? Jesus would have answered, because she's my wife, you dunderheads. If I didn't prefer her, I'd never hear the end of it. They just don't work. They just don't work. So enough of that. Enough of that, Jazz. You didn't come for that this evening. What do we know about the portrait of Jesus which is more accurate? Now, naturally, you heard from the introduction that I'm going to be kind of in favor of the gospel views, but not just on that basis, not just because it's in the Bible or anything else, but I like to, as an ancient historian, as a matter of fact, I was for 50 years a professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, and I finally hung it up last year because the students were switching the adjective, no longer professor of ancient history, but ancient professor of history. That was enough. That was enough. But no, what I like to do, and I think all of us should, if you choose to react with the image of Jesus or so, use your specialty, whether it's art or law or whatever else, use your specialty and approach this time-honored greatest story ever told. And in my case, I'm a historian. So I tried to use the tools of the historical discipline to pry apart all these wild images of Jesus and try to go back to what he really was in terms of the eyewitness testimony of contemporaries and in terms of the new evidence that we can get if we use all of the material which has come down to us from that all-important first century. Well, don't we have it all? No. We're getting more every month. Every year there's more evidence coming in from the archaeological finds that are being made. There are more interesting research into the documentation of the time. We have 2,000 years of good biblical scholarship. Most of it has been good. You don't hear about the good material. You always hear about the sensationalist, radical, revisionist views. They're the ones that make all the press and whatever else. But the solid scholarship which has been devoted to this so-called greatest life ever lived is copious and is getting better every year. You also have the new evidence of archaeology coming along, making spectacular discoveries, most of which you don't even hear about. I'm just amazed at that. And by the way, everybody thinks that archaeology is an old discipline. We even have sympathy for the poor archaeologist. His career is in ruins. Not too hot a joke, I realize. So if you ever try to dump one on the audience that way, do have a good chaser. Here's the chaser. Especially to our beautiful young co-eds here at Iowa State. Ladies, try to marry an archaeologist, because the older you get, the greater interest your husband will take in you. But it's a young discipline. It's only 125 years old. Scientific archaeology began in the 1870s. And look at the hundreds of thousands of artifacts that have been discovered that beautifully, 90% of them rather immediately confirm the biblical record. You can argue about the 10% if you want. You don't hear that. You always hear about the radical, over-the-wall archaeologists who have a totally different time grid from anybody else in the archaeological discipline, and therefore their evidence is going to come up differently, right? Computer people have a word for it: garbage in, garbage out. When you depart from the recognized international standard for archaeology and have your grid 150 years off, like some of them do, sure, you're going to get different results. But by and large, 85 to 90% of the discoveries being made in any land of the biblical world today almost immediately agrees with the biblical record. You can quarrel over the 10 or 15% if you want, but most of the archaeological discoveries affirm the biblical record. And some of the finds taking place are sensational in a good sense. For example, last century the German critics were coming along. I can attack the German critics because I have a German background myself, Maier, you can tell that. But anyway, they were saying, again, like some of the people today are saying, there never was a Jesus, a historical Jesus. You can see it in your computer blog, JesusNeverExisted.com. Some claims are made that he never existed, even as a historical personality. The man on whom we have more primary evidence probably than anybody else in the ancient world. Yeah, he never existed. Well, anyway, one of the critics was named Bruno Bauer. Now, he had originally been a good Christian, but he made shipwreck of his faith and then decided not only was Jesus not Son of God, he wasn't even a human being. He never lived. Well, then even Bruno's colleagues in Germany said, ja, aber. They said, wait a minute. Jesus does interact with historical characters like Caiaphas, the high priest, or Pontius Pilate, the governor who condemned him. Yeah, Bruno's answer was, those are interpolations. Somebody wrote those into the manuscripts to make the New Testament look good. Well, now, too bad old Bruno wasn't around in 1962 when an Italian archaeological expedition was digging away at the waterfront theater at Caesarea, and they came across a strangely shaped stone in a stair landing. They pried the stone out of the matrix, and they found an inscription on the other side. The inscription was in 2-inch Latin lettering, and it reads as follows. To the people of Caesarea, Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, has presented this building in honor of the emperor Tiberius. You know, I just wish old Bruno had hung around and not gone on to his reward, or whatever direction that was. I shouldn't be judgmental. Okay. I would have loved to have gotten Bruno's head in an arm lock and gently rubbed that unbelieving nose of his in the inscription. He could have learned via the Braille method alone that there was a Pontius Pilate. Yeah, here he shows up in stone, okay? This has happened repeatedly in history. All kinds of archaeological evidence has come along, most of it immediately confirming a biblical record. So to a historian, this says we better take a second look at this biblical material and not decide that it's all a collection of early mythology. Now here's another one. 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and of course a stupendous archaeological discovery. I'll give you another one that I think is right up there with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and nobody seems to know about it. I don't know why, but listen, the bones of the first biblical personality ever to come to life were discovered in November of 1990. It's kind of fresh discovery. I'm talking biblical bones. I'm talking the bones of a gentleman. There, I've given you a 50% chance right there. A gentleman who is well known in New Testament history. And you would think that everybody, even non-Christian, should know his name. Here's the story. November 1990, a bulldozer was excavating south of the temple area in the old city of Jerusalem. I should immediately point out, a bulldozer is not your average archaeological tool. Try brush. Well, the dozer wasn't intending archaeology. The dozer was building the base of a water park. Blue plastic slides and all. And it starts sinking into the ground. So they back it off, turn off the diesels, called in the archaeologists. They shined their flashlights down into the hole there, and without even going inside, these Israeli archaeologists could identify it as a 1st century AD burial site. How could they know that? Because there was a collection of 10 ossuaries inside. Those are limestone chests for burying bones. It's called the second burial method. They're running out of space in the Mount of Olives. You know, like that last scene in Schindler's List. Remember the movie? You can see how grave upon grave. Too many graves. So they were designing a space-saving way of burying people. So they now had the idea of putting the bodies in a sepulcher, let them decompose for a year or two, get the bones that remained and put them in one of these limestone bone chests. Jesus himself was in the second burial system. Hadn't been for the resurrection, as Christians claim, well, they'd have gathered his bones a year or two later and done the same thing. Anyway, now one of these ossuaries was magnificently carved, Beautiful, fluting around the edges, 2 giant rosettes with sub-whorls inside. I've never seen an ossuary so magnificently carved, unlike anything I've ever seen. So there's a VIP inside there, obviously. And on the other side is the name of the VIP. Give it you in Aramaic, and I'll bet quite a few of you will be able to translate. The name of the occupant was Yosef Bar Caiaphas. Yosef Bar Caiaphas. Who does that sound like? Caiaphas, the high priest who was the chief prosecutor against Jesus on Good Friday before the tribunal of Pontius Pilate. Very important person. How come nobody seems to know about that, including Christian pastors? I can be talking to a pastoral conference of 300 pastors, and I'll ask about the biblical bones. Well, 1 or 2% will know. I don't know how to get the story out. It is a lead pipe cinch. It's correct. They've done carbon-14 tests on the bones. They are from 20 centuries ago. They've done other tests to see the age of the bone at death. And we're talking about a 70, 75-year-old person. It works out perfectly only for this particular Caiaphas, the only one with that name, and it is, we might say, a lead pipe cinch. That is the case of the bones of the high priest. Even the Israel Museum, which is not Christian, has taken the question mark away. When they first brought it into the Israel Museum, they had a question mark whether this is the one. They've taken the question mark away. I think it's rather important to understand that the new archaeology taking place and the new finds being made are very, very friendly to the biblical version of what happens in the case of Jesus. Then we've got another test we can level to see if we're going to get reliable, fresh information on Jesus. What about the geographical test? We overlook that one all the time. Who needs geography anymore? We got a Garmin global positioning device. You can't even read them. Don't even need a map anymore. Well, the Bible is chock full of geographical names. So it's very important to see if we're getting a con job when it comes to the geography, or are these real places? Now, unlike the holy books of any other world religious system, the geographical locations inside of the Old and New Testament are absolutely authentic. Can't tell you all of them. First 10 chapters of Genesis, cut me some slack. Can't tell you where Eden is located, all right? But after that, we find it's been estimated that 93% of the place names are known, know where they are, and some have been excavated archaeologically. Now that's important, because so many other holy books begin like an English fantasy novel. At a time long, long ago, at a place called Middle Earth, or something like that. I'm not trying to make fun of other systems. I know, terribly politically incorrect, and I'd be stoned off the platform here. But I'm only trying to show that when you do talk about Bible lands, they are real. There is a real Jerusalem, a real Bethlehem, a real Nazareth, and places like that. We're not kidding anybody. These are real places. So one very important clue when you're checking out your holy book is, are these real places or not? Is the stage solid on which these things happen? And again, you find the Gospels passing that test beautifully. You got a travel record of St. Paul, taking 3 mission journeys at least. Luke faithfully recording wherever they went from place to place, and they're all traceable today yet. Luke's got the order right, is not screwing up the itinerary. So it's very, very reliable, the geography is. Then there's the final test. The words that have come down to us across 20 centuries. What about the other records? What about the inscriptions? What about the coinage? What about the history, which is being written by others 2,000 plus years ago? Now, that's very important information. Archaeologists dream of finding not only stones, but inscriptions. The words are so very important. We have indeed so much lost that I can't even begin to talk about it from the first century. Library fires didn't help. Oh man, remember the biggest library in the ancient world, 750,000 book scrolls? Library at Alexandria. And I tell my students in my ancient history courses, I used to, that if we'd have had the detail from those books that were burned up, the book scrolls, in the great library at Alexandria, every course in ancient history would be 6 times as long as it is, for which the students get their matches and are ready to burn down another library. I know. Yeah. I certainly know that. But there's been quite an amazing amount of secular outside material which has come down from the ancient Greco-Roman world, especially in that all-important first century. It's not only beautifully confirming every Roman official that shows up in the Gospels in the New Testament, or the Jewish rulers like Herod the Great. My goodness, Flavius Josephus gives us 2 whole books on Herod the Great. He has only a cameo role in Matthew chapter 2, but Josephus gives us 2 whole books on Herod alone. Same kind of character that shows up in the Massacre of the Innocents in Bethlehem. That's the kind of guy who could do that, because after all, he married 10 wives, all of them producing princes for him. And all the princes are scheming to succeed. If they didn't have 2 or 3 collateral plots in the palace before they had cornflakes in the morning, something was wrong. And so Herod finally executed 3 of his own sons on suspicion of treason. He put his favorite wife to death, the beautiful Maccabean princess Mariamne, killed his mother-in-law. All right, sorry, ladies. Should have said killed one of his many mothers-in-law. Okay. Killed several uncles, couple cousins. You might say Herod was a family man. Invites the high priest down to a swimming party at Jericho, drowns him. It's a kind of a guy who could have killed a dozen babies in Bethlehem very easily. But then we have additional evidence on other personalities in the Bible, like John the Baptist. Now you recall, of course, his story. But so does Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, never turned Christian, but he writes sober history as he sees it. He also reports John the Baptist's execution exactly like the Gospels do. He even adds precious detail to the Gospel record. Yeah, I'm telling you, these outside sources from the secular world are very valuable because they not only coordinate with the biblical record, but they add neat detail. In some cases, threads that have been left hanging in the Bible are tied down by Josephus. Incredible character. He was a genius. No fact escaped him. He wrote this enormous history of the Jewish people, 28 book scrolls. He wrote 28 times the size of material in one gospel. So here we get all the delicious detail that beautifully completes our picture of Jesus in his times in the New Testament. Now, case of John the Baptist. Where did he get executed? And don't some wise guy say at the neck? Yeah, we understand that. Where was the place where it happened geographically? Well, Josephus tells us that it happened at Maier, which was the fortress palace of Herod the Great at the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea. Now, it's important to know where things happen, right? And the Gospels don't tell us where it happened. Josephus does. I'm not knocking the Gospels. I'm trying to point out they're dealing in historical fact here, so much so that a non-Christian will report the same thing about what you find in the Gospel. Hey, Josephus even, in fact, I'm going to prove that all of you have used Josephus. You probably never heard of him before you came to this evening. Joe who people usually respond when I talk about Josephus? First century Jewish historian, born in the city of Jerusalem, 4 years after Jesus' crucifixion. He has a box outside seat to the events reported in the Gospels. If I were going to ask you what's the name of the little gal, daughter of Herodias, who did her dance of how many veils or whatever that is, that caused the death of John the Baptist. Altogether now, what's the name of the gal? Salome, you say correctly. That's right. And now you'll be shocked. You can't find her name in the New Testament. All you get for the beheading of John the Baptist is daughter of Herodias. How do we know her name, Salome? Thank you, Josephus. See how beautifully the evidence coordinates? Who was the first bishop of the Christian church anywhere on earth? And don't give me Simon Peter. He was not. The first bishop of the church, according to the Bible itself, was James, the just of Jerusalem, Jesus' half-brother or cousin. We're not going to get in that argument right now. But Eusebius, the earliest Christian church historian, says it was James, and indeed, we wish the New Testament would finish off his history, but it doesn't. Guess who does? Josephus. He says that 29 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin in the absence of the Roman governor, a guy who hadn't gotten there yet, who tried to do exactly what Pontius Pilate tried to do, and that is get Jesus off the hook. But Albinus, his name was, he arrived too late. By that time, they'd done a kangaroo court execution on James, the half-brother of Jesus, and here you have Good Friday 2. You have a perfect parallel to Good Friday. Good Friday 1, you have Caiaphas, whose bones had just been discovered, who's the prosecutor. In 62 AD, 29 years later, you have Caiaphas' brother-in-law, Ananus, who, again, saw that this stoning to death was kind of railroaded. But here you have, again, a perfect confirmation, a perfect mirror of what happened on Good Friday. And by the way, the second one was by a Jew who never converted to Christianity, so he's not some sweet gospel writer trying to make the New Testament look good. This authenticates the evidence even more strongly. And, of course, in a famous passage, Antiquities, book 1863, section 63, Josephus gives us the longest reference to Jesus in first century sources outside of Christian literature. Is in the middle of the reign of Pontius Pilate. And by the way, Josephus gives us about 5 major episodes in the life of Pontius Pilate, which are not in the Bible. And they're real, they happened. They explain why Pilate is acting so strangely on Good Friday, why he seems under pressure. Here's the answer Josephus gives us. This guy has not been mined enough for all the gold nuggets there inside. So anyway, right in the middle of Pilate's administration, he gave this wonderful testimony to Jesus, almost in Christian language. In fact, it was too good to be true. Yeah. My colleagues in the ministry or in the rabbinate will know that everybody agrees that passage had been interpolated. Somebody thinking to do God a favor took a perfectly decent passage on Jesus and baptized it, made it too Christian for words. The passage read something like this: about this time there was a wonderful man, if indeed one ought to call him only a man. He was the Messiah who rose from the dead. Now look, a good Jew would never have written that and stayed a good Jew. He would have been a Jewish Christian, like Paul of Tarsus. So we were told never to use that at the seminary. So, wind the clock back to 1955. I just graduated from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Young pup of a grad student. I was so ticked off that this largest reference to Jesus had been screwed up that I wrote the world's ranking authority on Flavius Josephus, a Jewish scholar in London named Paul Winter. And I asked Dr. Winter 2 questions. 1, do you think that Josephus ever referred to Jesus? Because the critics were saying, throw the whole passage out. Second question, if you think he really referred to Jesus, how do you think the passage read? 3 weeks later, got an airmail letter. This does nothing for you people, either instant messaging. I know. They cut me some slack, 55 years ago. Okay. Answer to the first question, yes, he was quite sure that Josephus was referring to our Jesus. Second question, using his good textual critical skills, he prized away what he thought was a Christian addenda by some stupid monk in the 2nd century or something, and gave me a version that I thought was very convincing. Tragedy. Paul Winter died before he ever learned how close he had come, because the great good news is that another great Jewish scholar, Shlomo Pines of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, discovered a manuscript tradition of Josephus that was not interpolated at that point. It reads almost word for word like what Paul Winter predicted it would read if they ever got the accurate manuscript. So in my translation of Josephus, that goes back in the text. And it's only at the end of the chapter that we have the rather Sunday schoolish, laundered version that we can't accept. And that is a very fair outside view of Jesus by someone who didn't necessarily believe in him, but he's trying to write fair history. Goes something like this. About this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles, the other nations, became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon their discipleship. They reported that 3 days later he emerged from the tomb alive. Now, notice he doesn't say he rose from the dead. He said they reported that he rose from the dead. See, that's the New Testament says the same thing. So he's trying to be fair. That's something a good Jew could have written. That he ends up by saying, accordingly, he could possibly have been the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to the present day. So this is what he actually wrote. And so there's brilliant outside testimony for the historicity of Jesus. And there are 5 other major references, about 12 in all, but 5 other major references in secular literature about Jesus. So how somebody can come along and claim that Jesus was only a myth, I shall never know. Just quickly to tick them off. Cornelius Tacitus, first century historian, he writes from the 2nd century into the 1st, gives us a year-by-year account of what happened in ancient Rome. And for the year 64, he reports the Great Fire of Rome happened under Nero's administration. And Nero's throne is tottering because it happened on his watch. So, to keep from being overthrown, Nero then has to search for other scapegoats. And he lands on the Christians. First time they show up in secular history. He says, the Christians are named, careful scholar, he says, the Christians are named for a Christ who was crucified by one of our governors, Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious superstition was almost eradicated, but suddenly it gained new vigor again. You want an outside proof for the resurrection and Pentecost? There it is. Suddenly it gained new vigor and even flowed as far away as Rome, that common cesspool into which garbage flows from all over the Mediterranean. So here's a hostile source, doesn't like Christianity, so much garbage. But that very fact alone proves that his concession that there was a Jesus crucified by Pilate and had followers is absolutely authentic historically, because it satisfies the great criterion of embarrassment. Hey, I'll get over these sidebars in a second, but listen, I got to give you a couple sidebars here on how does a professor of ancient history figure out if something claimed 2,000 years later really happened? The guy may be padding his story, maybe telling a fairy tale. We know the ancients love to pad their numbers, the historians. So how do we know that a fact claimed by an ancient historian is true? There are 12 tests, but 2 of the biggest. First is the criterion of multiple attestation, meaning, are there a lot of different sources not copying from one another that agree that this happened? Then that's a pretty firm. I mean, a lot of people say Julius Caesar assassinated, Ides of March, Julius Caesar, and it keeps going around. And yeah, probably happened. The other one is the criterion of embarrassment. You're arguing in a given direction, and yet you come across evidence that contradicts your thesis. But you got to admit it because everybody knows it's true. But you build a wall around it trying to explain it away, right? Then 2,000 years later, that problematical counter-evidence is absolutely authentic. See it? See, otherwise, they wouldn't have had bothered to defeat the argument. So here in a hostile source, it would have been in their interest to shut up about Jesus entirely. Tacitus thinks there's so much sewage, but he was an honest historian trying to figure out where this crazy sect started, okay? This is pretty overpowering evidence. Tacitus alone would prove the historicity of Jesus, but we have more. Suetonius, another famous Roman historian, writes Lives of the 12 Caesars, gives quite a bedroom history of them and so forth. It was a bestseller in the Middle Ages, by the way. That's the way it usually goes. But he says in reign of Claudius, there was a big demonstration riot in the Trans-Tiber area in Rome over the claims of Christ. Yeah. Pliny the Younger, governor of Asia Minor, he was across from the Bosporus on the Asiatic side of Istanbul. That's where Bithynia is located, northwestern Turkey. He writes the Emperor Trajan about the year 110, and he says, Dear Emperor, what do I do about these Christians? They get up early Sunday morning and they sing hymns to Christ as if you were a god. You know, so much for Dan Brown's claim this happened at the Council of Nicaea 225 years later. Early on. What do I do about them? They're against the law, aren't they? We got Trajan's answer. He said, Dear Pliny, yes, the Christians are against the law, and so if you can make a perfect case against them, I guess the law's got to be followed. But don't go hunting them out, and don't take any unsigned accusations which are inconsistent with the liberality of our age. See, there's a case where the Roman Empire is moderating. See, the persecutions were not one long horror story. They were on again, off again, on again, off again. But again, Jesus as God mentioned Christ and so forth. The Jewish rabbinic traditions mention Jesus. They're hostile also, but they admit there was a Yeshua HaNotzri, Jesus of Nazareth. They even give us the arrest notice published by the Sanhedrin for his arrest. It goes something like this. Wanted, Yeshua HaNotzri. He shall be stoned because he's practiced sorcery and he lured Israel into apostasy. Now, again, you might quick shoot reaction might say, wait a minute, this is no good. Jesus was crucified, he wasn't stoned. And isn't it terrible to call the Lord's miracles sorcery? No, for those two reasons, it's authentic. Future tense is used in this Aramaic inscription. Future tense, haven't arrested Jesus yet. No Jew would ever written he's going to be crucified. That's a Roman punishment. If they'd have caught Jesus anywhere but Jerusalem, any time except for when the Romans were there, how would they have terminated him? Stoning. Penalty for blasphemy. Rabbis have this wonderful account about how God's creating angels went across the world to create the world. Angel in charge of the forest, studied in all the trees. Angel in charge of the seas, poured out the oceans. Angel in charge of the rocks, however, hit some headwinds flying over the Holy Land. Had to drop them all there. It's the weapon of choice. Anybody's been to the Holy Land, is that right? Limestone outcroppings all over the place. It's the rockiest spot on earth. So this is realistic. And folks, did you notice the criterion of embarrassment showing up in that statement? Sometimes I'm asked, can we prove the miraculous? Well, obviously, not to everyone's satisfaction. This one comes close. He's practiced sorcery. Now, wait a minute. Wouldn't it have been simpler for that hostile source not to mention that? Because sorcery and miracle are the same thing if you're not talking cause. A miracle is something extraordinary or supernatural with help from above. Sorcery is the same thing with help from below. But in conceding that Jesus is doing something extraordinary or supernatural from a hostile source, this becomes very, very important testimony. So not only do the rabbinical traditions mention him, the two references in Josephus, You cannot say both were interpolated, not at all. Second time, he talks about Jesus' half-brother James being stoned to death. It doesn't work to say that Jesus was not a historical figure. Just doesn't work at all. Even some of the big critics of Christianity will concede finally that, yeah, there was at least a historical Jesus. We don't believe it anymore about him, but at least there was a historical Jesus. And I think the critics who try to dismantle Jesus by using the approach that he never even lived are using a false shortcut. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work intellectually. In fact, anyone making that statement should probably be embarrassed for having made it. Okay, those are the sources we use in trying to bring out some new information on Jesus. And I want to tell you, those are the sources that I'm looking for: the surrounding evidence, the geographical evidence, the archaeological evidence, and the documents that have come down to us. I do not get this additional information by direct revelation, okay? If this were the Bible Belt, I'd have to make that very clear. Because all your television evangelists on the tube in the Bible Belt, are talking about the wonderful two-way conversations they have with God. I told God and God told me, and I told God, God told me. I don't like those claims. I don't mind a person saying, I told God. It's called prayer. But God told me, better give that one a rest, huh? How subjective can you get? No. These are the sources we use. In terms of, real quickly now, to finish my presentation here, that's so you have a little hope. Going real quickly through the life of Jesus, here are some of the new items that we can talk about. Again, remember the Nativity account begins with a very un-Christmassy figure. Not Mary or Joseph or baby Jesus or Magi or shepherds. Caesar Augustus. How un-Christmassy a figure can you find? Has anyone ever gotten a Christmas card with a marble bust of Caesar Augustus on the front? Little slogan inside, Caesar's greetings. Do not think it would fly. But this is Luke's method. I'm using Luke's method. Luke is the one, especially the author in the Bible, who's always throwing an anchor out into the mainstream of Greco-Roman history to orient the people properly. So Luke begins with somebody everybody knew. The great Augustus, one of the best emperors Rome ever had. Too bad he was the first one, and no more. There were a few more. But nevertheless, this is to orient everybody. Luke's very concerned about the political background, and indeed Augustus did take censuses. When he died and he was put inside, his urn was put inside the mausoleum, earned his place in history, I guess you might say. Anyway, all right, I shouldn't have said that. I won't use it again, I promise. We have him having arranged the 36 major items that he accomplished for the empire. Point number 8, I took a census 3 times. A very, very important document there. I can show you a census document from neighboring Egypt. It's at the University of Michigan, Graduate Library. A guy registers himself at his own ancestral village for the house-by-house census of somebody during Hadrian's time, which was about 100 years after the first Christmas. Neighboring Egypt that took a Roman census every 14 years. The neat thing about that document is it's not a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's the original papyrus in which a guy named Horus registers himself and his family. Boy, they'll love that name. I'm Horus, a cultivator of state land, 48 years old. I'm the son of Horus, who is the son of Horus, and I herewith register my wife, Tapacusis, daughter of Horus. Oh, I hope that's a different Horus. And I register my firstborn son, Horus. And his brother, who was 7 years old, no identification marks. And our second son, Horion, that means Horus-like. Yeah. 1 year old with no identification marks. and so on. That scar, he says he's 48 years old with a scar on his left eyebrow. See, that's in place of a Social Security number, I guess, whatever it might be. So we have the census documents. We have some archaeological evidence, believe it or not, and that is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Let me explain why. Now, I used to be skeptical. The first 6 times I was in Bethlehem, I was convinced, oh, come on, we know Jesus is born here, but we don't know where, and so forth. Well, wait a minute. I did a study on the paper trail going back to that spot. For 19 centuries, the church knew that that was the cavern or grotto or cave where Jesus was born. Constantine's engineers, when they're building that first church of the Nativity, interviewed Macarius, the Christian bishop of Jerusalem. Do you know where Jesus was born? Of course we do. Yeah, church picnics there, or whatever his light did, or Christmas parties. Who knows? Anyway, so he could point out where, and that's why Constantine built at that site over the grotto that was hallowed since time immemorial. Now let's go back a century more. Let's go to the church father Origen, who tells us that whenever he went to Bethlehem, even the pagans there were willing to tell anyone who would listen where the great Jesus was born, whom the Christians worship. Now we're talking 220 A.D. What I didn't tell you is that Origen means son of Horus. But anyway, in Greek, yeah, okay. Now let's go back to Justin Martyr. We're talking now within 2 or 3 generations of Jesus. He talks about that grotto where Jesus was born. Finally, I had to bury some of my doubts because, folks, the place where Jesus was born was a tourist magnet, a pilgrim magnet. This was their Eiffel Tower. This was their Tower of London, their Colosseum, their Acropolis, their Parthenon. This brought the tourists and their money. Why would they ever forget something like that? So maybe I'm getting senile as I'm getting older, but on the other hand, I'm starting to doubt some of my doubts about some of those sites. So even archaeology comes along. In terms of Jesus' youth, the synagogue at Nazareth, where he gave his first public presentation, has been discovered. He then changes his address to Capernaum, as you well know. That's his main post office address during his Galilean ministry. Well, the synagogue where Jesus taught it's a later, 2 or 3 centuries later structure, but it's built on the foundation stones of the very synagogue where Jesus taught. Just 1 block further south toward the Sea of Galilee, we have the house of Peter discovered, which is where Jesus hung his hat during his 3 years of ministry. Remember, he stayed at the house of Peter. The authentication there might take 15 minutes. I'm not going to take it. But nevertheless, wherever Constantine wanted to consecrate a sacred location, he built a double octagon around the place. He had a double octagon around the cave. He had a double octagon around the house of Peter in Capernaum. We have the notation of a pilgrim nun in 380 A.D. Her name was Egeria. She writes, "Today we worshipped in the very house of Peter where Jesus lived, which the emperor has turned into a Christian church. And indeed, the 2-room house had the middle partition taken away and made a nave of a church out of it." And there are other clues there with graffiti on the walls, Jesus' names of the disciples, Peter, Andrew, and so forth. Pretty exciting. A boat has been discovered that Jesus could have used. Yeah. They call it the Jesus boat. That's too much. We can't call it that. Call it the Galilee Boat. 1986, no rain had come for weeks on end. It was the driest spring in memory. And the waters of the Sea of Galilee starts dropping. And so big, wide halo. A beach shows up for the first time. 2 brothers from Kibbutz Ginosar. You see how Gennesaret shows up today? One of the 4 names, Sea of Galilee. Anyway, these 2 brothers discover a buried ship's hull. And they were convinced it was a medieval Arab craft of some kind until they called in the world's ranking marine archaeologist. He flew in from Texas, by the way. And he identified it as a 1st century A.D. or 1st century B.C. biblical horizon hull. How did he know? Mortise and tenon construction used only at that time. Then they did a C-14 test on it, obviously. And by the way, carbon-14 is getting better and better, not worse and worse. Don't confuse carbon-14 with uranium, lead, or potassium argon. No, this is pretty reliable stuff. And it dated back 20 centuries, exactly right. So this craft alone gives us a neat commentary on Mark's gospel when he talks about the stilling of the tempest. In Sunday school, I was a terror. I didn't mean to be, but I was always asking the Sunday school teacher crazy questions. I was pleased, for example, at a Peter's house, they opened the roof and let Jesus down for the paralytic healing. Remember that one? You Christians? Okay. But my question, I was pleased that Jesus could heal a cripple, but teacher, what did they do about the roof afterwards? I mean, that's what I drew from the lesson. Hey, roofs are hard enough to keep dry. What? Oh, Paul, get lost. Stilling of the tempest. I was pleased that Jesus could turn off the wind, but how could Jesus sleep through a storm in the first place? Paul, ask your father, and so forth. Hey, now we know, because that Galilee boat that was discovered, the only protected spot would be under the rear decking where the helmsman would stand to guide the craft. And the only protected spot is under that decking, out of the cold wind, wet. Jesus can take a snooze. Now, Mark says he's also sleeping on the pillow, the cushion. What kind of a throwaway detail is that? And why does Mark say the? He implies it's part of the boat's rigging. He should have said a pillow, a cushion. No, you wouldn't say a rudder, would you? You'd say the rudder. Okay, so Mark is trying to tell us it's part of the boat's rigging. Now we know what it is. That crazy boat could be either rowed or sailed, because there's the remains of a mast block for the what am I trying to say? The mast. But now a storm. So what are you going to do with no keel to hold the boat up? Well, there's one way to do it. Ballast sack. Put your ballast sack on the windward side, however far out you have to take it from the center of the hull to account for the wind, and that'll keep it pretty stable. But a storm is coming up. What do you do with the ballast sack? You don't want an eccentric boat going through the water. You stow it a center amidships out of your way. Jesus is sleeping on the ballast sack. That's what that crazy pillow was and cushion. These are little fine details you can add to the biblical record when you tell the whole story. When it comes to the Passion story, of course, there the needle goes off the scale. John gives us almost an hour-by-hour, day-by-day account what happened during Holy Week. And I'm glad he did, because Jesus didn't take a move during Holy Week that hasn't been doubted or denied by some critic somewhere. And yet, every last detail in Holy Week rings out perfectly according to the canons of Roman jurisprudence. This is how a governor would have conducted a Roman trial at that time. The whole thing opens up when, again, you hear the politics behind the Good Friday episode. Really, it's the last aspect of the greatest story ever told that hasn't been told yet, except in a wonderful historical novel called Pontius Pilate. The author's name escapes me, although it is available on the table and back. Okay, I wasn't going to mention that commercial, but did anyway. Sorry about that. Okay. When you get Pilate's story, you do get the whole biblical background for what's happening on Good Friday. Why Pilate is acting defensively. Why he cannot cross the crowd when push comes to shove. And they play out the trump card about, if you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Whoever speaks treason against whoever calls this man a king is speaking treason against Caesar. The next line in John's gospel, Greek verb, starotheto, let him be crucified. It was the end of the trial, as far as Pilate was concerned. They had played out the trump card. What is that trump card? Yeah, the untold story of Good Friday. Resurrection, Boy, you know, I am making Mel Gibson's mistake. Remember Mel Gibson back when he had a reputation? Does the Passion of the Christ, 2.5 hours of agony and 30 seconds for the resurrection. It's a little unequal. I'll tell you one thing, though, and make a long story short. We are able, categorically, to prove that the tomb was empty. Now, that doesn't prove a resurrection. I'll be the first to say that. But the two phenomenal things happen on Good Friday. Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And again, I think we have 90% proof for that, or 85% or 80%. But there's a little item there called faith, which God, the greatest psychiatrist of all, wants people to respond to, because otherwise God is only a puppet master. He's only a marionette controller, and then we have no free will to oppose his thinking or whatever, and again, the God we have. Well, we can prove the empty tomb. It's one of the byproducts of the resurrection. 2 chapters in one of my books prove that. And so generally, to wrap it all up, the real Jesus shows up pretty well in the Gospels. And I think in subsequent decades, he'll show up even better, with more information coming in of an archaeological nature. All right, very good. You have a voice that carries very well. Did most of you hear it? He's talking about Professor Karen King of Harvard Divinity School and the Jesus Wife document, one of the Coptic Gospels, supposedly. Remember, the Smithsonian got all excited about it. Big ads. They're going to have a television special on it, trying to show that Jesus refers to his wife. It's a fraud. Total forgery. The Smithsonian show never happened. Why? Because it was proven to be a fake, because they had some of the same mistakes copied in a Coptic inscription in this little fragment. They only had a fragment because you can't really do much more in fraud by the way of adjusting a little fragment, see? And so it's a fraud. And that has happened before, believe me, including the famous Judas Gospel. A lot of spooky things about that one that are not hunky-dory at all. These people who commit archaeological fraud, and they do that also, I just hope there's a special cell in the warm place for these people who try to defraud trustworthiness. But it's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. It's totally worthless, that claim.
I've heard all about the front end, but I never heard about the back end.
I don't think they've caught the forger yet. I would highly suspect the guy that brought that document to Karen King. I really would, simply because he kind of innocently says, I hear you people are interested in Gnostic Gospels. I don't know if this thing has any worth. You want to check it out. And, of course, she immediately bought it hook, line, and sinker. And no further word about it. Mum's the word ever since, because it's a fraud.
Thank you.
Yep, you bet. Okay, in the absence, all those with loud voices, please use microphone, or stay where you are, for that matter. Oh, no, I can hear you pretty well, but why can't we get the electronics working? Oh, they're working on it. Okay, good. Okay, go on.
And the Pharisees say, Jesus rebuked your disciples for praising you on Palm Sunday and asking you to be our king. And Jesus replies, I tell you, if they keep quiet,
This should be on. Good question. I've used that already. That's called misusing the Bible, because it was a case of Palm Sunday entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and the Pharisees rebuked him. Look how they're praising you. And he says, listen, if these kids didn't sing, the stones themselves would cry out. That is the context. That's what Jesus meant by it. But let me tell you, a lot of Christians have used that for archaeology, because the stones do, in that sense, continue to cry out. Yes. Yeah. Nice point.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Yeah. So we heard a lot about, people misrepresenting Jesus, right? Like, authors were high on mushrooms, or Jesus a happy husband, or etc., right?
Yeah.
But for me, I can't really think of a less likely story about Jesus than that, he was born from a virgin, or, son of a jealous God whom we haven't really heard from since, raised from the dead, etc. So I guess my question is, why do you think that this story, which seems so horribly unlikely, is true, whereas, all of these other seemingly comparatively sensible stories aren't? Thank you.
Okay, so it's a very good question. We have extraordinary things that are happening, as claimed in the New Testament, and I'm not trying by any means say that I've proven all this. Of course I haven't. Have you seen anybody resurrected from the dead lately? I haven't. And so there are many things that happen, which again are beyond our normal experience, and so I can understand why somebody would ask a question like that. Sure, it's unlikely to have anybody born of a virgin. The whole incarnation is unlikely. The whole resurrection is unlikely. But maybe that is what proves it true. If you had a story that was perfectly coherent in many ways, then you might say that was invented by humankind. But when you have a story which is larger than normal life, God does things differently, you might say. And so that objection alone, that you have extraordinary stuff happening here, an unlikely combination of elements, wouldn't necessarily negate anything, because we'd expect God to do something differently. Now, I admit, if there were no contextual evidence, and we only heard about this divine being born of a virgin, suffered, died, and rose again, in the clips of the creed alone, and there were no context, it'd be difficult to believe. But when you have this whole thing preceded by a mess of messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, some of them absolutely uncanny. I just did a book on Advent, and I guess I was reminded again about these spectacular prophecies made by a Jewish prophet named Isaiah. This guy acts like he was at Golgotha. 700 years before Christ, he's giving predictions about what's going to happen to Jesus at Calvary. And other prophets like him. You don't find any book written over a 1,300-year period where you have prophecy on the one hand, fulfillment on the other. So that's part of the context. And then you have all this other context in which you can test out any of the political authorities that Jesus was involved with and get part of their biography from Roman history, secular history. So you have something totally here that absolutely has magnificent confirmation on the outside. That's why I love these outside sources. They are so neat, not only in affirming the scriptural thing, but in giving us neat additional detail. This is why I was so turned on by these accounts ever since Sunday school. Always wanted to know more. Good. We got others standing up or going to the microphone. Good show.
No, I got another mic or something.
Go on.
Okay. Was I correct in hearing that you said you thought there was substantial proof for the empty tomb?
Yes.
Oh, good, thank you.
Yes, we got sound.
What would you say is I would be curious to hear what your reasons are.
Proof of the empty tomb? Okay, I'll give you the 3-minute version, not the 20-minute version, okay? we have two forms of argumentation which we use. One would be an argument that the church has used for 20 centuries and is still as good as new and has never been contradicted. It goes like this. It's the answer to the question, and here's the question, where did Christianity first begin in terms of the organized proclamation that Jesus was the Messiah who rose from the dead? I want one spot on earth. And the answer is not the Holy Land, not Galilee, not Judea. One place on earth, the city of Jerusalem, is where the proclamation began that Jesus defeated death on Easter. Nowhere else. Now the point is, in Jerusalem, least of all could the organized proclamation of Jesus as the resurrected Lord ever have been promulgated if the moldering body of Jesus of Nazareth were still in the tomb available for view. There would have been no debate between the disciples and the Sanhedrin. They wouldn't have been in and out of prison as they were in the early chapters of the book of Acts. That would have been the end of it. Caiaphas would simply have said, you poor, deluded, fishermen, you believe in this dead criminal as, look, let me show you his body. He couldn't do that. The body was not available. Now, I'm not saying that an empty tomb proves a resurrection. Of course it does not. But if you reverse it, you can't have a resurrection, at least a decent one, without the tomb being empty as its first symptom. Now, the second argument that I add to that traditional argument is the Criterion of Embarrassment. Remember that one? Okay, I searched out Jewish rabbinic traditions. All of them agree the tomb was empty. They don't say the tomb was empty. They say Jesus' body was stolen. Same thing. You can say either there was money in the bank or it was robbed. Well, that means the money's not there anymore, okay? Same deal. So because of those two particularly, I challenged really any scholar to disprove my historical methodology on that one. It got interesting responses to that. New York Times Book Review gave me a rave review, and so did Billy Graham. I couldn't believe satisfying both Billy Graham and the New York Times Book Review. Most interesting letter I got was from a Jewish scholar in Tel Aviv, Dr. Galia Kornfeld. He was writing a book on the Jewish Jesus rather than the Christian Christ, so we knew which way he would take it. But he came across that argument, and he was convinced by it. Didn't become a Christian, no. But he had agreed the tomb was empty. And then I asked him, of course, how did he explain the empty tomb? And he responded by saying he thought that Jesus never really died. And in the cool of the tomb, he revived. Well, back in some days, we learned that was the old swoon theory, of the resurrection. And then I had to explain to Dr. Kornfeld the batting average for death by crucifixion was about 1,000 among the Romans. They didn't let guys escape by feigning death. Even in these human demolition derbies called gladiatorial combat, they had a little guy dressed like Pluto with a red-hot poker, and he would touch all the bodies that were on the ground, and if they flinched, pike went right through the heart. And in fact, that's kind of what happened on Good Friday. They didn't have red-hot poker there, but they had somebody with a lance piercing Jesus' pericardium and so on. So then Dr. Kornfeld said, I understand that, and I will indeed let you provide a response to my version of it. I couldn't believe he would do this. He was as good as his word. He gave this explanation for the empty tomb. I nailed him to the wall with it in a nice way, of course. It was his book. But he gave me the last word. You see, this is Christian-Jewish cooperation of the first water. So the evidence is really very strong.
Is there any documentation that the tomb was sealed with a seal once they buried Jesus in this tomb? And wouldn't there be Roman guards there? I've heard that there were Roman guards that, there were, when Jesus rose, that there were consequences, like they lost their life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's true or not. Is the
Paul,
Okay.
would you repeat the question?
Of course I had planned to. The question was about the Roman seal, Roman guards around the tomb. Would there be any archaeological evidence for that? No, we don't happen to have particular archaeological evidence there. But we do know there were rolling stone tombs. I can show you 15 of them in and around Jerusalem, for example. One of these would have had a Roman seal on. Not that it was sealed, caulked, cemented. No, like the seals you see in your electric meters. You know, little wires. Then that was the seal that nobody's tampered with your meter box. And so that's the kind of seal they would have, probably even a string or something with a seal. And so that you wouldn't expect something like that to survive. Now, I must, however, debate with you on the Roman guard around the tomb. We're not sure it was a Roman guard. I think it was a Jewish temple guard. Why would I say that? Well, it all depends on what Pontius Pilate said that evening when members of the Sanhedrin came and said, look, this deceiver claimed that he's going to rise from the dead. It was Saturday morning, yeah. This deceiver is going to rise from the dead. Make sure the tomb is sealed. So, guarded, I should say. Now, what does Pilate say? He says either, yeah, okay, take a guard, or you already have a guard. Make the tomb as safe as you can. Greek is usually very specific. So help me, both of those interpretations are decent translations of what Pilate said. And to this day, we don't know whether that was a Roman guard or a Jewish temple guard. I personally think it was a Jewish temple guard because where do these guys report? They don't report to their commander. They don't report to Pilate. They report to the Jewish temple authorities. There's no way on God's green earth they would have gone, a Roman force, to a Jewish temple authority. No. So I think the evidence is pretty overpowering. There was a Jewish temple guard. And so does Tertullian and a few of the church fathers. But again, good question. I'm not trying to knock your question, believe me. Yes?
How did Jesus get to Srinagar, to Kashmir?
How did, say again? How did Judas get to Kashmir? Jesus. I don't know that he ever went to Kashmir.
Well, the grave is there.
Oh, yeah, there is a claimed grave of Jesus somewhere in Asia, I guess, in Kashmir, India, yeah. Yeah, fine. Hello. I'm not going to grant any authenticity to that one at all. They do try to get Jesus traveling all over the world as a kid. Yeah, everybody wants a piece of the action. Christians are no exception. Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Ames, or whatever. You all want to have something to do with the biblical account. Very interesting itch, isn't it? Fun questions. Any others?
Yeah. So I'd like to thank you for coming out. And so in dialoguing with some of my friends about these issues, and some more on the radical fringe of these ideas, would question the underlying assumption that we have the text of the New Testament without interpolation. Or they would say we have a gap between the writings of the documents and when we have the manuscripts, even though they would grant, yes, this is the best evidence out of any work in antiquity, they would still be so skeptical as to say there's a gap there. And so how do you think the process of textual criticism comes in to that and can help us out?
Okay, very good question. You have to remember that the critics of the Bible will, first of all, try to deny the evidence that's plainly presented. But if they can't do that, then they will criticize the manuscript transmission, saying that you have a late manuscript here, and therefore it's not reliable. Fact is, we have late manuscripts for all the characters from antiquity. So that's not really much of an argument. But again, you have to remember that Islam and Mormonism both claim that our biblical documents have been somehow miscopied. And they use the illustration, of course, of the children's game called telephone. I whisper a secret in your ear, it goes down and so forth, and by the, well, you wouldn't have 800. But in a group of at least 10 or 12, you'd have a model then of biblical transmission. That argument was all but destroyed by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why? 2 complete scrolls of the prophet Isaiah found at Qumran. The earliest scroll we had of Isaiah before that was from 1006 AD. Now, these scrolls were 200 years old in Jesus' day. Do you see a 1,200-year gap here? Yeah. The Qumran Scrolls read 99.3% the same way as they do today and as they did 2,000 years ago. Generally, these are very carefully transmitted. Now, to be sure, any pastor will show you a Greek New Testament where the bottom of the page is 20% critical apparatus, showing how the various documents may disagree in tiny spellings or punctuation, and then they'll make a big fuss about it. Bart Ehrman, a case in point, University of North Carolina, has made a whole cottage industry out of those terrible variations. Well, the variations aren't terrible. They're really minor differences in spelling, sometimes a little bit. Not one variation of anything in the Old or New Testament has in any way changed any meaning or any doctrinal point in Judaism or Christianity. So really, that argument fails. No more questions?
I got one question.
Okay.
All right. You said the 90% correspondent with Josephus. I feel like the other 10% might be kind of important though. Just one quick question. The events around Jesus' death that are listed in the Bible, like the massive earthquake and eclipse and saints rising from the dead and walking around Jerusalem, I feel like, I've heard this before. It seems like those are the sort of things that would definitely be recorded by a historian of that caliber, and the fact that they weren't, I'm just curious, what would you say about it? Just trying to bring up a small point.
I just wish I had stopped with the previous question. You have asked the most difficult question you can ask of anybody interested in the Bible. I find that passage in Matthew very, very difficult, I must say. And I'll be honest, I do not have a good answer for that one. I really don't. Not that I necessarily had good answers anywhere. But what I'm trying to say is that one especially is quite difficult. It really is. I'll be honest about it. But the other details, like the darkness and the earthquake and that kind of stuff, and it's in that context, remember? Yeah, that we can show evidence for. Phlegon, Phlegon, is a Greek author of wonders. Like Ripley, believe it or not, by Ripley, again, your parents will know all about that. Most of what Ripley reported is true. Biggest tomato in the world ever grown in Iowa or something like that, Well, Phlegon, his name was also a Ripley 2,000 years ago, and he reported these strange things that had happened. You know what he said? He said in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was a great darkness at noon, so much so that at Nicaea, in Asia Minor, you could see stars in the daytime. And an earthquake took place which demolished many of the buildings in Nicaea. He's writing only about what he experienced. Now, what is the 4th month of the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad? Just for the heck of it, I figured it out. It is April of AD 33. That is the date for Good Friday. And that's not how I arrived at that date, believe me. It was only after we had the date in concrete that suddenly I realized, hold it, Phlegon's talking about the same thing. And just 2 months ago, they announced also in Jordan River excavations that the strata from 33 AD do show an earthquake disruption. So science is coming through for us in many ways. But again, I realize I have not answered your searching question. That's right. But again, I see Dr. Don here ready to sweep me off the platform. He's the hero. He's shutting me up. So let's hear it for Don.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.